Alright, so I was going to put up a tier list video today, but the editing process took a really long time, so you'll see that probably next week. But for now, what I've got for you is a bit of a story time video. Done a couple of these, but this one in particular has quite a good backstory to it, so I thought you guys might be interested. It's how I ended up almost losing my shoes in one of the biggest lakes in the entire United States. And it begins with me and a couple friends of mine who decide to take a road trip at the end of our high school career. Senior year just ended, we've got the whole summer to do whatever we want, and we decide for 2 weeks we're going to be going on a road trip. And this road trip spanned pretty much the entire east coast of the United States. We started by going west a little bit, and then we made our way all the way over to the east, and we saw just a ton of stuff. If I talked about the entire trip, we'd be here for ages. So I'm going to talk about a specific element of the trip, but I'll get to the lead up and I'll tell a bit of the story, and maybe I'll tell more stories about it in the future. If you would want to see more stories about that, please leave a like and a subscription, and you can click the notification bell if you're feeling extra crazy. But let's get straight into it. So, back in the summer of 2019, we started by going to Chicago. And Chicago's a great city. We decided to bike it, and biking it was probably the worst idea that any of us could have had, because we decided that we weren't just going to bike around the main city, see Millennium Park and see Navy Pier and some of the more iconic pieces of Chicago. We were also going to bike to a White Sox game. Now, if you don't know anything about Chicago, a Chicago White Sox game would be about 7 or 8 miles outside of downtown Chicago itself, and that's where we parked. That's where we did most of our activities for the day. So we go from downtown Chicago to the White Sox Stadium all by bike. We stay for about 5 or 6 innings, and we pretty much decide we don't want to stay in the south side of Chicago after dark for all that long, so we head back. After that, we are completely and utterly exhausted, and we go to a friend's house of the person who led the trip, and we stay there for the night. It was a nice night. We had a good restful sleep, and we woke up pretty early so that we could make our next stop on the journey. Cleveland, Ohio. Now, if you don't know anything about Cleveland, it's a city. It is one of the cities to ever exist. Now, they have one of my favorite NFL football teams, and by one of my favorite, I mean my absolute favorite NFL football team, the Cleveland Browns. I follow them religiously. I love the Cleveland Browns. I had to go to First Energy Stadium where they play. I got a picture outside of it, hung out around there. We went to dinner at this one place that was completely empty. It was actually kind of wild because this restaurant that we went to had absolutely nobody there. We asked the server, we were like, is this like normal? Is this something that happens a lot? And he basically said, yeah, there's absolutely nothing going on around the city right now. And so yes, this is pretty much the nightlife here. If there's no Indians game, if there's no Browns game, if there's no NBA game for the Cavaliers, if there's none of that going on, it's completely empty. It was just one of those things where you got in there and it just felt like you were kind of in a ghost town, which was really weird because you looked around and it's downtown Cleveland. It's a big city. It's one of the biggest cities in the entire state. So we go there and we have our food, and it's fine. It's solid food. It was definitely not the best food we had on the trip. We probably had that in Niagara Falls. I'm preferential to a place called Duff's. If you haven't heard of it, go to Duff's if you ever visit Buffalo, New York. It is absolutely incredible. A lot of famous people have visited there as well. So we go after this to essentially what is a pier where you can stand and look at Lake Erie. And Lake Erie is it's okay. It's a lake. We had just seen Navy Pier, and it had a really nice kind of view, and it was really friendly to bikers, and we had our bikes, and we had them parked, and we walked all the way to the end of Navy Pier, saw some seagulls, all that kind of stuff. Lake Erie was more of a park environment. You would go there, and you'd get your Frisbee, and you'd throw it with some friends, and we just hung out. We had a good time, and I'll skip ahead a little bit in the story here. We went actually to an Airbnb where we cooked our breakfast in our Airbnb. I don't know if the host of the Airbnb knew about this, but we brought our own little gas stove. We opened a window, set the stove right next to the window, made ourselves some eggs, had some milk. It was a fantastic breakfast for our drive the next day to Buffalo. I'll talk about Buffalo a little bit too, but for now, I want to focus on probably the funniest element of the story, which is when we decided that we were going to go out on the rocks next to Lake Erie. There was no signs or anything saying you couldn't go climbing on the rocks, and so we decide that we're gonna do so. And I have my blue hair. Yes, I dyed my hair blue at one point. I know that's unbelievable, but I did. And I took my blue hair and my Browns jersey and my jeans and my shoes and went out on these rocks next to Lake Erie, and they were a little bit slippery, let me tell you. I went out and didn't even take 5 minutes before my feet went straight into the waters of Lake Erie, and it went a little something like this. Here's the clip.
Oh, poor Grant.
So after that happened, we decided to pretty much book it out of there, go home, let my shoes dry out, my socks dry out, all that. Let me just say, it was a 2-week road trip. By the end of the road trip, we stopped by some laundromats. We tried to keep our clothes clean, but that van had a very distinct smell that I can only describe as about 100 Boy Scouts after a week-long camp, all of their dirty laundry put into a single van, was kind of the smell of it. And I don't know how it got quite as putrid as it did, but man, when we got home, it was like fresh air and we didn't have to be in the van anymore. So it was kind of nice to get home after all of that, because we finally had some fresh air after all of that, and we got to sleep in our own bed for that matter as well. But I'll continue the story just for a moment longer here. We also went to Niagara Falls after that, and to say that we didn't know our way around was a bit of an understatement, but I think the biggest element of what happened in Niagara Falls wasn't actually seeing the falls. The falls were beautiful. You can probably see some pictures of them on screen right now that we took. We loved Niagara Falls. I took some videos and kind of vlogged it while we're there. Maybe I'll post some of those videos here one day. But I think the most memorable part was when we got to our campsite. So about half of the nights that we were on this trip, we decided that we were going to camp and stay in either hotels or like kind of lodges, or we were going to be camping. So we split it in half, and on this particular night, it was a camp night, and we go to our place in Buffalo. It's way, way off the beaten path, and it just so happens to be raining very hard. It was raining buckets that night, and we had to set up our tent and sleep out in the pouring rain. We could have, I guess, hypothetically slept in our car, but it didn't really work out all that well to do so. So we ended up deciding that we were going to set up our tent there. But before we even did that, we had to go to our campsite on muddy roads. Now, we don't exactly have a car meant for treading some muddy grounds. We have a minivan, a green minivan. And so we took this green minivan and we start driving towards the back of the campground, and sure enough, it got stuck in the mud. We ended up having to call a tow truck in order to get our car out of the mud, and it looked a little something like this. So after that happened, after that whole kit and caboodle, what ended up happening is we realized that our campsite was at the very front of the property, and we just drove right past it. So being the geniuses that we were, we found a way to get our car stuck even though we really didn't need to. Fortunately, we had AAA coverage, so anytime we might get stuck, we could get that covered. Now, maybe at some point I'll talk about the one part where we couldn't get it covered, which is the next place we went, which is Toronto and Montreal. But honestly, I think that about covers a couple of some of the better stories for today. So if you liked kind of a little storytelling session here with myself, Jelswick, go ahead and like and subscribe, as I said earlier. It's always appreciated. And I will see you guys with a much more organized tier list next week. See ya.